The door of the Providence Creek meeting hall closed with a sound like a coffin lid shutting. It sealed Ilara's old life inside and pushed her out into the biting November air. At 18, she was an orphan, a pariah, and now an exile. Her mother and father were 2 weeks in the ground, taken by a fever that had swept through their small farm with the speed of a grass fire. The town's fear, sharp and cold as the wind, needed a sacrifice. Ilara was it. Inside the hall, Mr. Gable had delivered the verdict. He was the owner of the town's mercantile, a man whose piety was as wide as his waistline and as shallow as a saucer. He stood before the council, his voice thick with false sympathy. For the health and safety of the community, he declared, the farm had to be quarantined. Ilara, having nursed her parents to their last breath, was a risk. She had to be removed. No one spoke for her. The faces she had known her entire life, farmers, the blacksmith, the pastor, were a wall of stony silence. They looked at her, then away. They were good people, she knew, but their goodness was no match for their fear. Gable's words were the rocks, and their fear was the current that carried them along. He would manage the farm, he assured them, until the contagion had passed. Everyone knew what that meant. The farm, with its rich bottomland soil and timber stand, was the best in the county. Mr. Gable had wanted it for years. Now he had it. He pressed a few silver dollars into her palm. The metal was cold and insulting. "For your journey," he said, not meeting her eye. Then came the final, cruel twist of the knife. He handed her a folded deed. "The council has seen fit to grant you title to a plot, so no one can say we cast you out with nothing." He almost smiled. "The sump." A nervous titter went through the room. The sump was a local joke, a patch of barren, wind-swept acreage a few miles from town. Its only feature was a massive, stone-lined hole in the ground, an old cistern from a long-failed settlement, dry for 50 years. It was worthless, a blight. Giving it to her was like giving a drowning man a stone. Ilara looked at the coins. She looked at the deed. She did not cry or beg. A cold, hard thing was forming in her chest, something heavier than grief and stronger than despair. It was resolve. She turned her back on the silent faces and walked out of the hall. Her father's old dog, a scruffy terrier mix named Scamp, trotting silently at her heels. He was all she had left of them. She did not go to the stagecoach office. She walked across the muddy street to Gable's own mercantile. He was already behind the counter, rearranging his tins, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. He watched her enter, his eyes narrowed. She walked past the bolts of cloth, the barrels of candy, the promises of a life she no longer had. She placed her silver dollars on the counter. "An axe," she said, her voice steady. "A good one. A shovel. A 50-pound sack of flour, 20 of salt, and a box of nails." Gable raised an eyebrow. "Going logging, are we?" The question was a barb. She stared at him, her gaze so empty of emotion, it seemed to unnerve him. He gathered the items without another word. The cost took every last coin. She hefted the axe and the shovel, hoisted the heavy sacks onto her back, and walked out of the store, out of the town, without looking back. She turned her face toward the wilderness, toward the worthless land that was now her only home. Scamp padded beside her, a small, loyal shadow against the vast, uncaring landscape. The journey to the sump was a punishment. The 3 miles felt like 100. The sacks of flour and salt dug into her shoulders, their weight a constant reminder of how little she had. The wind was a physical force, a bully that pushed and slapped at her, trying to tear the supplies from her grasp. The land grew steadily more desolate, the rich soil of the valley giving way to rock and scrub. The trees became stunted, twisted things, bent into permanent submission by the wind. Scamp stayed close, his nose to the ground, occasionally looking up at her with worried eyes. He was the only warmth in a world that had become uniformly cold. The sun was a pale wafer in a gray sky, offering no comfort. By the time she saw the place, her muscles were screaming and her hands were raw. It was worse than she had imagined. The sump was a scar on the land, a treeless expanse of gravel and hard-packed dirt where the wind blew without ceasing. And in the center of it, the cistern. It was a gaping mouth in the earth, a perfect circle of expertly laid stones, 20 feet across. It looked like the eye of a dead god, staring blankly at the sky. Despair, which she had held at bay with the sheer effort of the walk, washed over her. It was a physical blow, buckling her knees. The town was right. The mockery was justified. This was a place to die, not to live. She slid the sacks from her aching back and sank to the ground, the full weight of her loss pressing down on her. The wind howled, a long, mournful cry that echoed the hollowness inside her. Scamp nudged her hand, whining softly. The wind was relentless, clawing at her clothes, stinging her eyes with dust. For a moment, she considered just lying there, letting the cold take her. It would be easier. But then she thought of Gable's smug face. She thought of the silent, complicit town. The cold thing in her chest hardened again. Not yet. To escape the wind, she scrambled to the edge of the cistern and peered in. It was deep, maybe 12 feet to the dusty bottom. A few weathered rungs of an old iron ladder were still bolted to the stone near the top. Testing one with her foot, she found it surprisingly solid. Driven by a primal need to get out of the punishing wind, she slung the axe over her shoulder and carefully climbed down. The moment her head dropped below ground level, the world changed. The roar of the wind vanished, replaced by an almost shocking stillness. The air was calm, the silence broken only by the sound of her own breathing and the distant howl of the wind passing over the hole above. She let go and dropped the last few feet to the bottom, landing in a puff of fine, dry dust. She stood in the center of the stone cylinder and looked up at the circle of gray sky. She was in a stone bottle, shielded from the world. As the afternoon bled into a frigid twilight, she ran a hand along the stone wall. She expected it to be ice cold. It wasn't. The stone was cool, yes, but it lacked the biting frost of the rocks on the surface. She pressed her palm flat against it. There was no warmth, not really, but there was a distinct absence of cold. Curious, she knelt and placed her hands on the floor. It was packed earth and stone, and here she felt it. A faint, almost imperceptible current of energy. It was not heat, not like a fire. It was a deep, resonant neutrality. The ground beneath her feet was not frozen. In a world that was rapidly plunging toward freezing, the bottom of this hole was holding at a steady, stable temperature. It was a geothermal fissure, she realized, a deep crack in the Earth's crust, leaking a ghost of warmth from the planet's core. It wasn't enough to heat a house. It wasn't enough to even feel like a hearth. But it was enough to keep the frost at bay. It was enough to make the temperature at the bottom of this cistern 10, maybe 15 degrees warmer than the surface. In that moment, standing in the dark at the bottom of a hole that everyone else saw as a grave, Ilara saw not an end, but a beginning. The sump wasn't a joke. It was a secret. And it was a secret she would keep. Despair evaporated, replaced by a grim, ferocious purpose. This hole would not be her tomb. It would be her fortress. The next morning she began to work. Her world shrank to the dimensions of the cistern and the small, defiant acts of creation. First, she needed a proper way in and out. The old iron rungs were a hazard. Using her axe, she felled a slender, straight pine from the sparse woods at the edge of her property. It was brutal labor. The axe felt clumsy and heavy in her hands, and each swing sent a shock up her arms. Blisters formed on her palms, broke, and bled. But she persisted. She chopped notches into the log, creating a crude but sturdy ladder, and lowered it into the hole. Then, she began the monumental task of building a roof. This hole was a shield from the wind, but it was open to the sky, to the rain and snow that would surely come. She spent days felling more of the scrawny pines. They were not proud, straight timbers, but they were what she had. She learned the rhythm of the axe, the way to use her body's weight, the sharp crack a tree makes just before it gives way. She hauled the logs, one by one, to the edge of the cistern. Her muscles screamed. Her back felt as if it were breaking. But with each log she moved, the hard thing in her chest grew stronger. This was not just labor, it was defiance. Each drop of sweat was a word in an argument she was having with the town of Providence Creek. She laid the logs across the opening, fitting them as tightly as she could. It was slow, frustrating work. The logs were uneven, and gaps remained. She left a 4-foot square opening in the center, which she would cover with a trapdoor. To seal the gaps, she hauled buckets of soil and sod from the surrounding land, packing it thick between and over the logs. Her roof was a mound of earth, an ugly but effective barrier. From a distance, her home was becoming little more than a low hillock on the barren plain. Now she turned her attention to heat. The geothermal warmth was a blessing, a passive foundation that kept the deep cold out. But to survive the winter, she needed a fire. A fire inside the cistern would fill it with smoke. A fire outside would be useless. The solution came to her as she studied the seamless stone walls. She would build a small fireplace on the surface, just outside the cistern's perimeter. But the chimney, the flue, would not go straight up. She would build it down, running it along the inside wall of the cistern. She would use the cistern wall itself as the back of her flue. The hot smoke and gases would travel down the stone, heating it as they went, before venting out a low-to-the-ground opening far from the shelter. The entire 12-foot height of the cistern wall would become a massive, slow-release radiator, a thermal battery. She needed stone and mortar. While digging a latrine pit a good distance from the cistern, her shovel struck something dense and slick. It was a rich deposit of gray clay. It was perfect. She spent days digging it out, mixing it with water and sand to create a crude but strong mortar. She gathered flat stones from the surrounding fields, hauling them on a makeshift sledge she built from pine boughs. The work was meticulous. She built the small firebox on the surface, then began laying the stones for the flue down the interior wall, plastering them with her clay mortar. Her hands were caked in it, her knuckles raw. But as the structure took shape, so did her hope. It was an audacious, perhaps insane, design, but in her gut, she knew it would work. Water was the next problem. The cistern was bone dry. For the first week, she drank sparingly from a small canteen she'd had, refilling it at a creek 2 miles away. It was an unsustainable chore. Then she noticed it. In the cold mornings, the upper stones of the cistern, closer to the frigid surface air, were slick with condensation. The faint warmth and moisture from the earth below were meeting the cold from above. With the tip of her knife, she began to scratch a tiny, shallow groove into the mortar between the stones, a delicate channel that snaked its way around the circumference of the cistern. It took 2 full days of painstaking work. She guided this channel to one spot, where she placed her only pot. Drip, drip, drip. It was a maddeningly slow collection, but it was clean, clear water. A few quarts a day, enough to survive. Still, she wanted a more reliable source. Trusting her instinct, she chose a spot a few dozen yards from the cistern, where the ground seemed ever so slightly greener. She began to dig. For 2 days, she hit nothing but rock and dry dirt. She was about to give up when the soil at the bottom of her 4-foot hole grew dark and damp. She dug another foot, and water began to seep in, slow but steady. A clean, cold spring. She spent the next day lining her small well with stones to keep it from collapsing. She had water. Her supplies were dwindling. The flour and salt were precious, but they would not last the winter. She needed more. She needed life. With a few coins she had found sewn into the hem of her mother's old coat, she made the hard choice to walk back to town. The return to Providence Creek was an ordeal. As she walked down the main street, conversations stopped. People stared. Children pointed. She was a ghost they had already buried. She saw Mr. Gable standing on the porch of his mercantile, a smug smirk on his face. "Well, well," he called out, his voice carrying across the street. "Look what the wind blew in. The Cistern girl. Tired of your hole in the ground already?" She did not look at him. She kept her eyes forward and walked to the far end of town, to a small, struggling farm owned by an old man named Silas. His wife had been kind to her mother. She bought 2 scrawny chickens from him for a price that was more charity than commerce. Then she went to the blacksmith and purchased a small, heavy cast-iron door for her fireplace. On her way out of town, she dug up a handful of potato seedlings that had been discarded behind the mercantile. The journey back was even harder than the first. She carried the heavy iron door in one arm and the crate with the 2 squawking chickens in the other. Scamp trotted ahead, clearing the path. Every muscle burned, but her mind was clear. She was not just surviving now, she was building. Back at the sump, she installed the iron door into her firebox. It fit perfectly. She built a small coop for the chickens against the exterior wall of her new flue, where the radiant heat would keep them from freezing. They were her first livestock, a tiny, feathered promise of food, of eggs, of continuity. Scamp was her constant companion in the solitude. He was her guard, his sharp barks echoing strangely in the cistern whenever a coyote or fox ventured too close. He was her warmth, curling up at her feet on a bed of pine boughs as she slept. He was her audience, watching her with his intelligent eyes as she worked, as if he understood the magnitude of her task. He was the living link to the love she had lost, and his presence kept the crushing loneliness from swallowing her whole. Her final project before the first snow was the garden. She hauled buckets of the richer soil from the woods down her ladder, a back-breaking relay that took days. She spread it a foot deep in a corner of the cistern floor. The space was dim, lit only by what little light came down the trapdoor opening and, later, by a single lantern. But the temperature was stable and warm. She planted her scavenged potatoes and a handful of carrot seeds. On a decaying log, she found a bloom of oyster mushrooms and brought a piece of the spore-laden wood inside, placing it in a dark, damp corner. It was a desperate gamble, an underground garden powered by the earth's own warmth. One afternoon, as she was mixing clay, 2 riders appeared on the ridge. It was Mr. Gable and a trapper named Brant, a man known for his loud mouth and cruel humor. They rode down to her settlement, their horses snorting in the cold air. They saw the mound of dirt, the makeshift chimney pot, the crude trap door. They did not see the well, or the chickens, or the 12 feet of solid engineering beneath their feet. "Living in a hole like a badger, are you?" Brant shouted, laughing. He spat a wad of tobacco near the entrance. "Hope you've dug it deep enough for a grave." Gable just shook his head, a look of profound, pitying contempt on his face. "We offered you a place at the church poorhouse," he said. "Pride is a cold blanket, girl." They rode off, their laughter carried back on the wind. The name stuck. In town she was no longer just Ilara. She was the Cistern girl, a cautionary tale, a fool who chose to live in a ditch. The mockery was a fresh wound, but as she retreated into the quiet stillness of her home, she felt the stone walls around her, faintly warm, and knew their judgment meant nothing. Then the snow came. It fell for 3 days, a thick, silent blanket that covered everything. The world outside her trapdoor became a landscape of pure white. Her isolation was complete. Her life shrank to a series of quiet, rhythmic routines. Each morning she would rise in the dim light, the air in the cistern cool but never freezing. Her first task was the fire. A few small logs in her efficient firebox were enough. The smoke would curl down the stone flue, and within an hour, the entire western wall of the cistern would begin to radiate a deep, penetrating warmth that filled the space. She would check her chickens, who clucked contentedly in their warm coop, and collect the single, precious egg one of them usually laid. She would check her water supply, the slow drip of condensation and the bucket from her well. She would tend her strange, subterranean garden. Under the constant, low glow of her lantern, the potato vines were sprawling, green and miraculous in the darkness. The carrots were sprouting. The mushrooms had begun to fruit on their log, pale and beautiful. Her world was one of sensory contrasts. The howling fury of the wind overhead, and the deep, profound silence below. The blinding white of the snow outside, and the earthy, firelit dimness within. She was the sovereign of this small, warm kingdom of stone and earth. She was utterly alone, but she was not lonely. The work was too demanding, the rhythms of survival too absorbing. One night, a new sound joined the wind's howl, a low, guttural snarling. A pack of wolves, lean and desperate with hunger, had scented her chickens. Scamp erupted in a frenzy of barking, his small body a vibrating knot of fury. Ilara climbed the ladder and peered out. 6 pairs of yellow eyes glowed in the darkness. They were circling her mound, cautious but determined. Her heart hammered in her chest. But the fear was cold and clear, not the hot panic of helplessness. Her home was a fortress. They could claw at the dirt roof, but they could not get in. She stoked the fire until it roared. Then, using a pair of tongs, she pulled a burning log from the firebox. She climbed the ladder and hurled it out into the snow. It landed with a hiss and a shower of sparks, and the wolves scattered, melting back into the night. She had been tested, and her systems had held. The snows of early winter were just a prelude. In January of '83, the Great Freeze began. It was not a storm, but a siege. The temperature dropped, and it did not rise again. It fell to 10 below zero, then 20, then 30. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, and the air itself felt sharp enough to cut. The wind was a blade, and it never stopped. In Providence Creek, it was a catastrophe. The town was built of wood, designed for ordinary winters. It was not prepared for this. The first casualties were the windows. Mr. Gable's large panes at the Mercantile, his pride and joy, cracked and then shattered in the night, letting the lethal cold pour in. His stock of canned goods froze solid and burst. Chimneys, contracting too quickly in the brutal cold, cracked and failed. Houses that had been cozy for generations became iceboxes. Families huddled in a single room, burning furniture when their woodpiles ran out. Livestock, left in barns that were no match for the relentless cold, froze to death where they stood. The town's confidence, its belief in its own permanence, shattered like glass. The community's infrastructure and its spirit began to break. But 12 feet under the surface of the sump, Elara was warm. The mound of earth and snow over her log roof was a perfect insulator, feet thick. The wind screamed over the top of it, unheard and unfelt. Inside, the air was still. Her small, ingenious fireplace needed only a modest amount of wood, which she had diligently stockpiled. The stone of the cistern wall, a colossal thermal mass, soaked up the heat and radiated it back steadily, day and night. The temperature in her subterranean home never dropped below 50 degrees. She was not fighting the cold. She was simply outside its reach. While the world above was dying, her potatoes were ready for harvest. Her chickens laid their eggs. The water in her well did not freeze. She was an island of impossible warmth and life in an ocean of crystalline death. She knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and validating, that the town was wrong. The first knock on her trapdoor was faint, almost lost in the wind. Scamp heard it first, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Elara froze, listening. It came again, a frantic, desperate pounding. No one knew she was here. No one would come here unless they had no other choice. She climbed the ladder, her hand on the axe she kept near the top. She pushed the heavy door open a crack. The cold that hit her face was stunning, a physical blow. A figure was collapsed in the snow, barely more than a bundle of rags. She dragged him inside, slamming the door against the brutal wind. It was Brant, the trapper who had mocked her. His face was a mask of gray, waxy frostbite. His hands were black. He had been caught in the open, his own cabin's fire having failed. He was delirious, muttering about the cold. He had been wandering for a day, and by some miracle had stumbled upon her mound. She faced her first moral choice. This man had laughed at her. He had wished her dead in this very hole. Her stores were finite. Her firewood, her food, it was all carefully rationed for one person. Helping him came at a cost. She looked at his frost-bitten face, at the desperate animal fear in his eyes. She thought of her parents, helpless in their beds. She could not. She cut away his frozen boots and gloves. She wrapped his hands and feet in cloths soaked in cool water, the only way to treat the frostbite without causing more damage. She fed him warm broth from her potato harvest. He wept, not from pain, but from the sudden, shocking return of warmth. He was the first. A week later, the real test came. The knocking this time was stronger, more authoritative. She opened the trap door to see the face of Mr. Gable. It was unrecognizable. The smugness was gone, replaced by a raw, primal terror. His beard was caked with ice. "My daughter," he choked out, the words ripped from his lungs by the wind. "Hannah, the fever's come back. The house, it's an icebox. The doctor's medicine freezes before we can give it to her. She's dying, Cistern girl. Please." The name was not a mockery now. It was a plea. He was begging. This man, who had stolen her home, who had cast her out to die, was now begging her to save his child. All the bitterness, all the rage she had buried under months of labor, rose up in her. It would be justice to slam the door in his face, to leave him to the cold he thought was her rightful portion. She looked at his ravaged face, the face of a father about to lose his child. She saw her own father's face in her memory. The moral choice was no choice at all. Her own survival was meaningless if she became as cold as the people who had wronged her. "Bring her here," Elara said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the wind. She helped him fashion a crude sled from split logs and rope. She gave him her own warmest blanket. And as he turned to go, she whistled for Scamp. "He will guide you," she said. "He knows the way back in the whiteout." Gable stared at her, at the dog, his eyes filled with a dawning, terrible understanding of the grace he was being offered. Then he turned and plunged back into the storm, the small dog a determined shadow at his side. Ilara went below to the warmest corner of her home and prepared a place for the sick child. Hours later, they returned. Gable descended the ladder first, carrying his daughter, a fragile bundle wrapped in every blanket he owned. He stepped off the last rung onto the earthen floor of the cistern, and he stopped, utterly stunned. The warmth hit him first, a gentle, enveloping wave. It was not the dry, scorching heat of an overstoked stove, but a deep, humid warmth that felt alive. His frozen lungs ached with the relief of it. Then his eyes adjusted to the lantern light. He saw the neat stack of firewood, the simmering pot, the tools hanging in their proper places. He saw the impossible garden, a patch of vibrant green life in the dead of winter. He heard the impossible sound of chickens clucking softly from their coop. He looked at the walls, the seamless, expertly laid stone of the flue, radiating heat like a living thing. He touched it, and the warmth was solid, real. He could not reconcile this place, this ordered, ingenious, warm sanctuary, with the narrative he had constructed. This was not the hovel of a foolish girl. This was the work of a master builder. "How?" he whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. He looked from the thriving potato plants to the slow-drip water collection, from the solid roof to the warm floor. His gaze fell on Ilara, who was calmly taking his daughter from his arms. "We were wrong," he said, the words cracking with shame. "I was wrong. We called you a fool." "My God," his voice broke completely. "We were the fools." Ilara did not answer. She did not need to. Her creation spoke for her. She gently unwrapped the shivering girl, placed her in the prepared bed near the flue wall, and began to spoon warm, salted broth between her pale lips. She did not offer forgiveness or condemnation. She offered soup. She offered warmth. In the face of his broken pride, her quiet, practical grace was the most profound statement of all. Hannah Gable survived. In the steady, unwavering warmth of the cistern, her fever broke. The chill that had settled deep in her bones finally retreated. For a week, Mr. Gable lived in the cistern with his daughter, a humbled guest in the home of the girl he had exiled. He became her servant, chopping wood, hauling water from the well, his arrogance stripped away and replaced by a quiet, awe-struck reverence. He saw the relentless labor and brilliant ingenuity that had gone into every stone and every log. Word got back to town. Brant, now recovering, had told his story. Gable sent word with another desperate man who stumbled to their door. Soon, a small, freezing contingent from Providence Creek made a pilgrimage to the sump. Ilara could not house them all, but the heat from her cistern was not entirely contained. It radiated out, warming the ground for yards around. They built crude shelters against the earthen mound of her roof, sharing the fire from her hearth and the food she freely gave. She saved the very community that had cast her out. When the great freeze finally broke, the world thawed into a muddy, grieving mess. The survivors of Providence Creek looked at their ruined town and then at Ilara's untouched sanctuary, and they understood. The story of the Cistern girl spread, but the name was no longer a mockery. It was a legend. People came to the sump not to sneer, but to learn. They descended the ladder into her home and saw the future. They saw how a structure built with the earth, insulated by it, warmed by it, had triumphed where their proud wooden boxes had failed. They saw the wisdom in thermal mass, in subterranean gardens, in building for the worst winter, not the average one. The town of Providence Creek rebuilt, but it rebuilt differently. Foundations were dug deeper. Houses were banked with earth. Stone, once seen as a nuisance to be cleared from fields, was now a prized building material. Mr. Gable, a profoundly changed man, used his own funds to build a new town hall, its foundation deep, its walls thick and insulated. He never tried to reclaim Ilara's parents' farm. He deeded it to her, properly and legally, an act of public penance. Ilara's Cistern home became a landmark. The sump was renamed the Foundation on all new maps. Travelers carried her story to other settlements, a tale of resilience and ingenuity that changed the way frontier people thought about shelter. She never moved back to town. The cistern was her home, the place she had forged herself. She expanded it, digging new chambers, perfecting her systems, her life a quiet testament to the power of seeing value where others saw only waste. Years later, Ilara, no longer a girl, but a woman whose hands were calloused and whose eyes were clear, would stand at the entrance to her home and watch the sunset paint the sky. She had been given nothing but a hole in the ground and the contempt of her neighbors. From that, she had built not just a shelter, but a life. Her legacy was not written in laws or ledgers, but in the very landscape of the valley, in the stone walls of a rebuilt town, and in the quiet strength of a woman who had been discarded, and in return had taught a whole community how to endure.